In today's video, I'm going to give you 20 really helpful drawing tips from one of my best-selling online courses. So to celebrate the fact that I'm having a sale on one of my best-selling courses, which is Complete Drawing for Beginners, I'm going to give you 20 of the tips that are in the course completely for free today. And you might be saying, why would you give us 20 tips from the course, Michelle, without us paying any money? It's because it's just a small amount of the stuff that you can get in the course. So whether you're interested in that course and getting it at a sale price, or you just want these free tips, do keep watching. There are 10 modules in the course plus bonus modules, and for each of these 10 modules there are 2 sort of subjects, so I'm going to give you a tip from each of those, and that's how we get our 20 tips today. So let's get started. So module number 1 goes through all the art materials you need to start drawing, all of the equipment, and some tips for shading too. So let's look at 2 of those tips now. You do not need a lot of expensive equipment to start drawing. One of my favourite tools is an embossing tool like this. They come in various shapes and sizes. If you don't have one of these, you can use a nail art tool. They're pretty much the same thing. You can buy them very cheaply. Or you can use something like an embroidery needle, basically any hard point that's not sharp on the end and won't cut your paper. What you're going to use it for is making fine lines. So you're going to dent the paper. I've drawn a petal here. And then when we shade over the top, we're going to get these beautiful white lines appear, something that would be very hard to achieve in any other way. One technique that's going to be an absolute game changer for you is blending. I'm using a paper stump. These are very cheaply available. You can also use a cosmetic tissue wrapped around your fingers. There are many other things that you can try, such as cotton wadding or Q-tips, I think they call them in the US. You can not only smoothly blend your pencil, but you can also use the tool to move soft, shadowy graphite into other areas. It'll be an absolute game changer for your work. Module number 2 is all about scaling, all about how to get your picture to fit your paper and lay everything out nicely. Let's look at a couple of layout and scaling tips now. Accurately drawing something from a photograph means sort of transferring the proportions across, and the best thing to do to start with is to make sure that your photograph is the same proportions, not necessarily size, but the same proportions as your paper. Now, I've shown this technique before, it's always very popular, but if you've seen this before, feel free to use the timestamps to click onto the next tip. But what we're going to do is we're going to place this photograph in the corner. I'm using very small photographs and paper here just so I can get it all on camera. Obviously, you'd use something much bigger. So you're going to place your photograph in the corner, take a straight edge. You don't need a set square like this. You can use a piece of printer paper. You're going to take an imaginary line corner to corner, and then you're going to extend that line out. Here it's coming out of the side of my paper. Now I just square off my paper like this, and this area here is the same proportions as my photograph but larger. What's more, I can take any point along this line. Let's go here and make a smaller area, and we'll square off this edge too. And again, I've got an area that's exactly the same proportions as my photograph. You can even take this line further up and make an area that's smaller than your original photograph if you need to scale down, not up. Now, I get lots of questions about this, particularly for people that are using things like canvases or stretched paper where they don't want to cut the edge off of their paper. I've addressed that in another video. You'll find it in my drawing tips playlist. If I can find it, I'll link it in the description of this video too. One technique that's less precise but nevertheless very useful is to check an angle of something in your photograph. Here we've got a distinct slope on this snowy picture. What you need to do before you can check any angle is make sure you're on the same rotation as your paper. There's no point your photograph just being loose. You're not checking any angle that way, so you need to line up the edge of your photograph with any edge in your picture, preferably fairly close to where you're going to be working. And then you can take your angle with a straight edge like a pencil and just transfer it across. I like to put my finger here so that I can then get a rough idea of the angle of the slope. Angles don't change no matter how big or small you're drawing something. And if you're interested in painting this picture, I've got a full free tutorial. It was part of last year's Winter Landscape Challenge. I'll link that in the description of this video. We're going to be using this angle technique later in this video to draw more specific items. Module 3 is where we start moving on to actual subjects, and I tried to cover just about every basic subject that you would need in this course. And we're going to look first at still life and buildings. When you're drawing tall buildings like lighthouses or perhaps even columns or church towers, it can be a struggle to get them properly upright or even symmetrical. A good trick is to take a center line. So you just think, whereabouts you think the center is, top or bottom. Take a right angle up. You don't need a special tool for this. You can use a piece of printer paper that's square cut to get your right angle. What you're going to do then is use a strip of paper to check the width. So find the side that you think looks the best. I like this left-hand side here. And in any part of this, we can take another line across and I can check the width. So I'm checking the width on the left there, move it across to the right, and already I see that I need to make this side a little bit wider. You can check the width in any part of your picture. Something's gone very wrong up the top here, hasn't it? So let's check this curve here. So again, I'm going to take a line across. So we see the curve comes down at this side, and also it's just not the right width. So again, I'll check here, place my mark here, and I can start to get this looking a lot more accurate. Here's a quick tip for finding the center point of a wall that's at perspective. So I've got the side of a house here, and I've got maybe a wall or a fence here, and perhaps there's a gate in it halfway down. But the problem is that because it's at a perspective angle, that center line is not going to be midway between this point and this point. It's going to shift because of the angle of the wall and the perspective we're viewing it at. We don't need to work it out. All you need to do is take a straight line, one corner to the other, and repeat. Now take a guideline up through the center of the cross. This is the center of your wall. And remember that when you actually draw your little gate in, it's going to be a little bit bigger this side. We know this is closest to us because it's wider. As it gets narrower, as it goes away from us, then we'll have a little bit less on the other side. And now we've got perfect placement. Module 4 looks at flowers, leaves, gardens and trees. Here's a trick I always use when I've got complex shapes such as multiple stems and leaves all crossing in and out and behind one another. If I have two leaves, for example, that are overlapping, rather than try and draw my leaf here and see where it appears the other side, this is always likely to be inaccurate. It's just never going to look very realistic. Let's erase that one. Instead, what you're going to do is just draw through that foreground leaf as if it wasn't even there, and then just erase the parts that you don't need. In this way, you're going to get perfectly realistic stems, branches, and leaves that look completely realistic to the eye. Have you ever tried to draw a garden path going into the distance and found that it just ends up looking like it is almost like a ladder up to the sky, and it doesn't seem to lay flat in your picture? The reason for that is this width that you've got here. Now, the only time you would see a path go up like this and disappear over a line like this at width would be if you were literally going over a hill. So if there was a hill in your picture or something like a waterfall that dropped on the other side, then that would be realistic. Instead, try emphasizing the horizontal a little more. And when you get up to this horizon or hill here, what you're going to do is just seamlessly take the line of the path into that horizon line, and you'll see you get a much more realistic effect. What would a drawing course be without landscapes? Module 5 looks at landscapes and seascapes. Let's think about where we place a horizon in a landscape from the point of view of composition. A horizon halfway up can be quite balanced, but it also tends to look rather dull. It's not something you definitely shouldn't do. If you've got something really interesting in your picture, you can make this work. If you have a big, expansive landscape, a landscape that's quite flat, then a lower horizon can emphasize a big sky. It looks open and expansive. This is a good idea if there really isn't much going on in your foreground, but you've got a really interesting sky. Alternatively, a high horizon can be a great idea if you have a lot of interest in your picture, perhaps mountains and hills, and there's not much going on in your sky. A high horizon will emphasize the foreground, a low horizon will emphasize the sky. Here's a simple tip for drawing pebbles, rocks, stones, however big or small they are. Remember, they're going to be partially buried in the earth or the sand, and so rather than doing them too circular, which can make them look very strange, like they're tipping up towards you, you always want to make sure that your rocks and pebbles have a fairly flat base on. This could be tiny little pebbles that you're seeing on the beach or much larger rocks. It's going to help them to lay flat, and it's going to give your picture a sense of 3 dimensions so that you're viewing across. And not only are these things buried in the earth, but you've got some foreshortening going on as well. In other words, because you're not viewing them from above, they're going to look a little bit longer and wider. This will help to give you very realistic looking rocks and stones. Before we do the next 10 tips, can I ask you quickly just to press that like button, that thumbs up? It would make me so happy. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm. And don't forget to subscribe. We have over 300 free painting and drawing videos on this channel, and it's completely CAT approved. In Module 6, we look at figures and faces. Here's a very basic rule for placing features on a face. I call it the halfway rule. So the eyes are halfway down the head. This is the main thing people get wrong because we tend to not realize just how much of the head is taken up with the forehead, especially when people have hair covering this area. So the eyes are approximately halfway down from the crown of the head. If we take this line here and divide it again from here to here halfway, that's about where the nose comes to. And then finally, if we take this line here and divide it from the base of the chin halfway, this is about where the mouth comes. In reality, people's features don't sit on straight lines, they sit on slightly curved lines. And these proportions here can move up or down and become closer and further away if somebody's head is tipped up or down. But this is a basic one to remember, and it's a good place to start. One of the most basic pieces of advice when drawing smaller figures in the landscape or tiny figures further away is not to draw feet. Now that may sound really strange, everybody's got feet, but you'll notice that they're often foreshortened and turned away from us. They're often blocked from our view as well, either by a slight bump in the road or perhaps some grass or some sand, or just because the person is so far away you can barely see the smaller features. It's a great place to start just to think about not really emphasizing the feet too much. As soon as you start to emphasize feet or hands, I'm having a go at drawing this little figure over here. As soon as you start to emphasize those things too much, then you can end up with the person just looking rather cartoonish. So when you're drawing figures at a distance, it's a good idea just to minimize how much footage you give them. Module 7 will help you to draw animals and birds. When you first start to draw animals and people, you'll often want to start with the detail, possibly the head, but this is a mistake. Instead, particularly with animals, you want to look for overall shapes. You've probably seen those cartoons where animators start by drawing people and animals moving just by drawing sort of teardrop shapes and circles and squares. We can take this approach with something like this polar bear. We can look at the outside shape. He goes straight up the back here. We can think about his body and where it comes to. Again, look at this angle from the feet here. We can think about putting that in and just starting to think about overall how he is constructed, starting with these really simple shapes. This is going to give you a good basic outline. Once you've got everything in proportion and looked at all of those basic shapes, looking particularly for these curved areas, adjusting as you need to, then you're starting to get an idea of how this animal sits on your paper, using these basic shapes to get yourself started before you put any detail in. Is so disheartening later on to find out that everything's in the wrong place when you've taken ages drawing a pretty polar bear face. Drawing the shape of a bird is not often that hard, but one thing that is really difficult is placing the eye. Now, sometimes we have some markings like this. That can be a great help in placing the eye. But often, because the skull of the bird is so covered in feathers, often this eye can just be sat in a sort of a blank area. And it's really difficult to get it in the right place. You keep drawing it and drawing it, it never looks quite right. So using angles like we looked at earlier in the video can help you to place these things. So we can start by perhaps adding some of these markings. So I can start to get an idea of where the markings are, and that's going to help me to place where the eye goes. But I can also use angles to help me place that eye. So again, placing the picture close to where I'm working, I'm going to look for some kind of reference point that I can take to place the eye. Now, the most obvious one is the point of the beak. So I could take the point of the beak to the base of the eye like this, and then transfer that line across. This is going to give me at least a little bit of an idea of where that eye is going to sit. And there are multiple places I can take angles from. For example, the top of the peak of the feathers, or something further down like the wing. All of these are going to help me to place the eye in the correct position. Module 8 is all about transport, planes, trains, cars, and of course, boats. Tracing paper can be useful sometimes, but if we trace everything, then we never improve our drawing. And also, you might be drawing bigger than your picture, and tracing paper is not really going to help. But tracing paper can help you to see things more clearly. So if you're looking at a boat and you're just struggling to know what kind of shape it is, then we can place our tracing paper on top, draw around the boat or any object really. And it's just going to help you to see it more clearly for when you're drawing it larger. You can see the angles. It's now separated out from everything else that was going on in that picture. It looks less confusing. You can see how long it is compared to how wide it is. You can see the angles that things sit at. And all of a sudden, it becomes much more easy to draw by eye, just because you've isolated the shape and just given yourself a little bit of help. So we've looked at using angles to place an eye on a bird, but let's look at something that's, you can see it's full of angles here, and some of them are quite subtle because things like cars and planes and boats, they have both square angles. They seem to be very square, but when you look at them, they've also got an awful lot of subtle curves. So we can measure the angle of things. The angle of this back tail wing here, and forgive me, I don't know the proper terms, and the one here which is opposite are not identical. There is a slight change. You can't, for instance, take a straight line from one to the other. You see that they curve out at different angles, and it's going to allow us to get all of this right. What we can do with these wings, however, is we can take sort of a center line through the middle, so that's another angle that we could use. We can also use these angles to check if things are in the right place. I could take an angle from the top of the plane here, for example, through to this little tail fin here. And if the angle was different on my picture, then I'd know that was wrong. So I've started sketching the body here, ignoring the fact that I'm obviously going to go way off the paper here. Obviously, it's just a YouTube demo. I'm not going to complete this drawing. And, one of the things I could look at is I could measure how far along this little wheel strut here was. But another thing I can do very, very useful is I can get an angle for it. As I said, you want to place the paper along the edge of your drawing paper, and you need to put it where you're working. So here, I might want to take this angle down here. So I could go from here down to here and get an idea of that coming out here. But for the tail, for instance, I might want to come sort of here. And as I said, I could use an angle to go through a center line here. I could also, because these are at different angles, I could also go from one corner to another and give myself a guideline like that. That would be a really useful guideline to have. So I could take sort of a guideline through like this and then start using that to think about drawing this fin. I could look at this top here, because if you just look at this by eye, you're probably likely to think it's fairly straight. It looks fairly horizontal, but actually when you place, let me line it up correctly first, when you place a pencil on top, it's actually got a strong downward angle. and we can start getting things like this in. And this will enable me to begin drawing accurately. All of these things can be adjusted later on. I can draw by eye, for example, and then I can go back and I can check that angle. And I see that it actually needed to come out a little bit more like this. So angles in drawing vehicles are so important, both for checking an individual angle of an item, but also for checking the distance and the spacing between things. Angles never change. If your angle between one thing and another on your paper is different to where it is on the photograph, then you know that something has gone wrong with your proportions or your drawing. In Module 9, we start looking at a couple of tricky areas, and that's text. In other words, if you're drawing something like a sign and you need to lay out the numbers and the letters so they fit in the right place. And we also look at drawing hands. Let's look at how to place text into a box, for instance, if you have a sign. So I've written the word watercolor twice here. I've got the English spelling here, and I've got the American English spelling here. So we have an extra letter here, so it's quite a good example to use. So if you just start writing watercolor in a box like this, I'm sure you've done this. You just run out of space and everything ends up smushed up or doesn't fit in the area. So what we want to do is find the center point. Now, with the English spelling, the center point is the letter C. With the American spelling, the center point is actually a gap. So we have the C on one side and the R on the other. So in this example, we have 5 letters this side, so we could put the R at the end. And that means that the halfway point is going to be the L, and then we can put the O's in. Again here, we'll put the W up the other end. The T is going to be in the middle of that space with the E and the A. I'm not doing this very neatly, but you can see the rough idea. I would also actually make a line down the bottom here for these letters to sit on. Now with this one here, again, we've got the C in the middle. We've got 5 letters each side, so I can put the O, the R. I've got another O here, a U, an L. And you see how we start to space things out in our box, finding these center points and fitting everything in between so that we don't go out the edge of the area. Hands can be fiendishly difficult to draw, can't they? Whose hand is this? This is Chloe's hand. Chloe works for me part-time, and she helps me with a little bit of my video editing and my admin. And this morning while she was working, I said, Chloe, come here, can I photograph your hand, please? And she was very obliging, and we love her blue nail varnish. So one of my favourite techniques for drawing a hand is to enclose it in a shape. So this is called the envelope technique. I'm going to show it very briefly here, but I have a full video on how to use it. I'll link that in the description of this video. You can see that Chloe's hand has sort of foreshortened, so the wrist appears a lot more narrow and the fingers appear larger. That's because when I photographed, I was closer to this side. So all of these difficult structures in the hand and foreshortening can make it really, really hard to see where everything goes. And if you just start drawing around and then try and draw the fingers, I guarantee you'll go wrong. So what we'll do instead is we'll enclose this in a box. So I'll be looking at shapes and how things would be if there were a square-sided shape round. So I say a box, but really what I'm talking about is a multi-sided shape, and how many sides that has depends on the complexity of the image. And we might go across like this. You can put a curve in if you need to, but you're going to start, and I just want to check this angle here. I think we'll come out a little bit more. You're going to start by just making a rough shape that your hand will fit into, and from here that will enable you to start getting the shapes in the correct place. It's a rough guideline. You can adjust it or go slightly outside of it anytime you need to, and it's going to start you drawing a hand or any tricky shape. It's also really good for figures much more easily. Module 10 is all about creating texture. So we're going to look at textured surfaces like stone and brick, and also how to paint hair and fur. There are many ways to get texture in a drawing, things like cross-hatching, but people often overlook actually putting something underneath your paper if you ever did things like brass rubbings at school. I've got a piece of torn sandpaper here. I've changed to a harder pencil. This often shows up better with a slightly lighter pencil initially, and we can get some really interesting textures. Almost looks like the edge of mountains, doesn't it? If you're looking for texture on rocks or beaches, you need to use something underneath that's pretty heavily textured. One of the things that works fabulously well is that old-fashioned wood chip paper or sometimes handmade paper with those lumps in. Don't overlook this technique for getting natural textures in a way that might be hard to draw by hand. When drawing things that grow like fur or hair or grass, it's really important to draw them in the direction they grow. That's because as you lift your pencil off of the paper, it will taper. So if we're trying to draw grass or fur, for example, imagine if we take our strokes downwards like this, they start to look very stubby. If we take them up and out in the direction of growth, then we get a much more natural looking stroke. Hair, fur, grasses, anything that grows out from the base, all of these things naturally taper. So make sure your pencil lines are going in the direction of growth. So after making my drawing course a couple of years back, I decided that it needed more content because when you purchase an online course from me, you get lifetime access and free upgrades. So I added a couple more things to the course that I won't cover today because they're full step-by-step tutorials, but I'll show you a picture of them. So I added a full step-by-step tutorial for a nice cat in graphite pencil. And I also added a portrait of a girl. And this one is done on coloured paper. And this is using the Eau Troy crayon technique. I can't say anything in French. Basically, it means drawing in 3 colours. It's a traditional technique. It's very, very beautiful. And I give you a full multi-video tutorial in the course. So if you're interested in buying my drawing course at a discount price, do have a look at the links in the video description. If you're watching this video in 2 years' time and this course sale has long passed, and I very rarely have, course sales on the larger courses throughout the year, maybe once, maybe not at all. If you're watching this video in the future, the best time to grab a discount off of my larger courses is in the Christmas sale, which starts on Boxing Day and usually runs through to New Year's. But before you leave this video, do make sure you have a look in the video description. Downloading any of my free courses will get you on my mailing list. You'll be up to date with any new courses I launch, any discounts, any offers, and of course, my weekly newsletter will also remind you of the latest YouTube videos in case you should miss any. And if you enjoyed this video and you haven't taken part in my 9 days of sketching challenge yet, I'll link that video at the end. That one's entirely free. And if you want to get back into your sketching, if you're just starting out or if you just haven't found the time lately, that's a great little challenge that'll just get you going quickly. You can watch that video right now.